Well, let's look at this picture right here. This is an actual picture from space, projected, down at about 1,000 feet. On the left there, that's the Dead Sea, and we're facing almost directly south right here. So, if you've been to Israel, you may have been to that little green patch that's right there in the middle. You may have. Well, that's kind of green. It's not very green, and there's not much water. But coming out of this canyon on the right here is there's actually a waterfalls up at the top of this canyon, just off the screen here. And there's a nice little stream that comes out here. It flows down this creek down here, and it goes off into the Dead Sea. And that's one of the famous places that David, when he was running from Saul, was hiding from Saul in a cave up there. So that's a very famous camp. Does anyone know the name of that place? Do you remember that?
En-Gedi.
En-Gedi. Yeah, it's En-Gedi. So if you ever go to Israel, go to En-Gedi. It's a pretty cool place because this looks like the moon out here, which is kind of right. And then as you walk up this valley right here, it's a great walk. You walk up there and it gets more and more treed and more lush, and you start seeing goats on the side of the hillsides. And at the very top of your trek up there, you see this wonderful pool and a waterfall. And En-Gedi is actually a very famous place that's tied to David. So why are we looking at that? It's not because of that. I want to follow the Dead Sea further south, and in a second, if you're prone to motion sickness, you might want to cover your eyes. We're going to fly there in the picture here. We're going to fly down to the southern tip of the Dead Sea, and in doing so, I want to point out something that's at the bottom end, so hold on to your seats. Here we go. So we're on our way to the bottom of the Dead Sea. We come up to almost to sea level right here. We're only at sea level. That's how far below sea level it is. Past the evaporation ponds that are in the bottom end of the Dead Sea right now. And then there's actually a very small community at the end of the Dead Sea that wasn't there not too long ago because the Dead Sea level has been receding because of evaporation. And because of the receding evaporation, it's caused a land bridge to form between Israel on the right of the screen right here and Jordan on the left of the screen. But at the very bottom, you see there's a community there. We're looking down here because this is kind of where they think that Sodom and Gomorrah was, right down there. For years, it was always supposed that it was under the water on the southern tip of the Dead Sea. Now that's becoming exposed. They're starting to do some digs, and they're finding some very interesting things from a long time ago. But Sodom and Gomorrah were down there to get you oriented to the geography of what's right here. Also, on the left there, those hills that on the left, the east of the Dead Sea, the bottom, that's Moab. And I put a verse there so you can find out why Moab is called Moab. And Moab was one of the two incestuous sons of Lot by his daughters. So that's how Moab came to be called. By the way, too, Moab, if you know any Hebrew, anyone know any Hebrew? Not me very much, but you know that A-B almost always means father. So Abraham, the father of nations and stuff like that. Ab and Moab is father. Mo, in a slight version of Hebrew, means from. So when you know that Moab was actually the son of Lot, named by Lot's daughter, and she named him from dad. It's kind of icky. Yeah, really, when you get there. So that's Moab. And then further down to the south there, those hills in the distance down there is Edom. So we hear about Edom all the time in the Old Testament. And you can, if you look at that verse right there, Genesis 25:30 tells you where Edom comes from. Edom, when, remember Jacob and Esau? When Jacob and Esau were born, remember Jacob stole Esau's birthright, and Esau traded in his birthright for some stew or whatever it was that particular day. And the stew happened to be red in color, and red in Hebrew closely sounds like Edom. So from that point on, Esau, his nickname in a way was Edom. So everywhere you see Edom in the Old Testament, think Esau who lost his birthright. So that's what we see way down there. So in general, in this picture, as we look south, everything that's on the left of the picture is Israel. Everything on the right of the picture is not.
That's the other way.
Did I do it wrong? Everything on the right of the picture is Israel. Everything on the left of the picture is Jordan, Moab. Okay, there we go. That's because we're looking south. That's it.
You're backwards.
Yeah, I'm backwards. There we go. So why are we talking about this? Well, because we have to introduce this great picture of Jacques Tissot, where he stood there in Genesis 19, and he watched as Sodom and Gomorrah came under judgment of God. Really, and if you remember the story, Abraham, that's Abraham's stand. Abraham is actually there pleading for God, saying, "Look, if we find so many people there, will you save it? Yes, we will. How about fewer? How about even 10? If you find 10 people, God says, yeah, if I find 10 people, I'll save it." But there's not 10 people. And in that story, then, Lot, who happens to have moved down there, is extracted before the judgment of God comes. It's really something. To this day, there is some archaeological evidence, actually over in the foothills of Moab. We saw there on the left of the screen, in the foothills of Moab, of some houses that are extraordinarily old, that are covered with pitch and are burned. Now, it doesn't mean it's necessarily got Sodom and Gomorrah, but it would fit the story, and it'd be incredibly old. So why are we talking about that? Well, because Peter brings it up today, doggone it. Peter brings it up in 2 Peter, and he's jumping right into this central topic about the enemy within, that is false teachers in the midst of the believing community. Now think about the timeline here. This is being written maybe within a year of Peter being killed. I mean, it's pretty much the last things that he'll be saying to people. And because of that, we're in the early 60s, somewhere in there. Well, remember, Jesus was died and resurrected in the early 30s. So now it's been 30 years. It's been 30 years that Peter's been doing ministry. And he's gotten a lot of response from people, which we'll see a little bit later, about the fact that, hey, I thought you said Jesus was coming back. And yet it's been 30 years and he hasn't come back yet. So what's the deal here? I thought Jesus was going to come back. He's not coming back. And on top of that, we surmise, people were saying, listen, not only are we anxious for Jesus to come back, but when is he going to bring justice against all the people who do bad things to us? Is God sleeping when it comes to justice? When is God going to correct the record? So these things are kind of going around in Peter's mind, and they flavor what he's going to talk about today. But interestingly enough, if this indeed is, in Peter's mind, the last chance he gets to tell them something super, uber important, especially now that we're on the cusp of 250 years of grotesque persecution, what's on Peter's heart? What is the greatest danger to the Christian community? The greatest danger is not the politics and power of Rome. The greatest danger is false teachers. So that's what we're going to look at today. And he's going to talk about the fact that even though it's been a while since Jesus was there, 30 years, their destruction does not sleep. Whose destruction? The false teachers. Wow. This is the big topic of the last chance Peter has to talk to them. So let's just jump right in. We're in the beginning of chapter 2, and he says, we read this last week, false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you. And when he says false prophets also arose among the people, he's talking about Old Testament. Talking about Old Testament, where basically people would trot up and say, well, thus saith the Lord, and they would talk in place of God. And God has some tremendously bad things to say in the Old Testament against people who say they're speaking for God when they are not. You know, if God exists and he's just, you don't want to do this. But they did this, and they got away with this, okay? In the New Testament period, in these 30 years since Jesus was resurrected, there started to circulate some written stuff about Jesus. We know that Paul, especially, he wrote the earliest stuff in the New Testament, probably, and that in the early 50s. So by the time that Peter's writing this, Paul's writings have been in circulation for 10 years. And they've gotten around. And later on in Peter's letter, he'll say, you've read Paul's stuff, and sometimes it's difficult. So Paul's stuff has been in circulation. So when you want to have false prophets in the New Testament, they know that they can't get away with saying, thus saith the Lord, not as easily as they can actually come to the scriptures, like Paul's letters that are in circulation, and say, well, what Paul means by this is, and they twist what's written. So in that sense, you move in this era from Old Testament style falsehoods of thus saith the Lord to New Testament style falsehoods, which is, well, thus saith the scriptures, but you don't actually interpret what the scriptures say. That's the main mode of deception when you get in the New Testament. And which, by the way, in our current current era, that's the main mode of deception today. Probably by a factor of 9 out of 10 deceiving religious populations. What you'll see is people saying, well, I don't disregard the Bible. I actually accept the Bible. So now let me tell you what the Bible is saying by pulling verses out of context or by retranslating or whatever they want to do. They'll do. So actually the smart move to enable people to be deceived is to say, I believe the Bible, but then interpret it wrong. That's largely what's done today. Very few people get away with today trotting around saying, well, I had a vision from God and thus saith the Lord, and it's in contrast with everything in the Bible. You can't get away with that as well these days. But why? Well, because we open our Bibles and say, well, I don't think so. But false teachers, yes. Thus saith the Scripture. So Peter says, as prominent as that was in the Old Testament, it is prominent now. And in fact, it has probably been going on for 30 years since the death of Jesus at this point. There have been false teachers. This is his chief anxiety about the church with him being absent coming up. So there'll be false prophets, false teachers. Let's talk about them. Who secretly bring in destructive heresies. Okay, buckle your seatbelt. We're going to do a little bit of Greek stuff because Peter picks, as for a fisherman, this is amazing. He picks some really colorful words here. And you'll see in just a second what I'm talking about. He gives us a clue about how they do it. Who secretly bring in destructive heresies. This secretly word literally is 3 different Greek words put together. Para, which means, alongside or with, eis, which means in, and ago, which means to lead. So it means to take a deceptive thing and lead it in alongside what you know to be true. And this is the way they do it. This is the way it's done today. It's the way it was done then. It's not to actually say what I'm reading in the Bible is wrong. What it says is, I like that. Hold that thought. Now let me, like you lead in a donkey, I'm going to lead in alongside of that something that's wrong. And that's what's done today. That's definitely what's done today. The bad tactic is to look at the Bible and say, well, that stuff's all wrong. The clever tactic from Satan is to lead in alongside something that just slightly skews what's actually there. Beware. I mean, even in using that word, it causes us to say to ourselves, if we want to test these things, if we want to be careful, make sure you just look explicitly at what's in the Word. And if someone says, this is what's in the Word, but I'm going to add a little bit just to kind of highlight what's there, all your alarm bells ought to go off. And there's nothing wrong with that, because we do a lot of that here on Sunday. We kind of talk between what's there to kind of enlighten it. But if someone brings in something that's like, I don't know. You got to watch that. The safest approach for you and for me, let's just stick with what's on the Word. Let's stick with what's right there. So they lead in alongside. And these heresies, actually that word is Greek itself. Heresis. It means, that's Greek. Heresy is a Greek word. But it's interesting because it's used many times for a faction or a party. So when it talks about like the faction or the party of the Sadducees, it calls them the heresies of the Sadducees. Because when you see the word heresy, it doesn't just mean, spurious, truth. It doesn't just mean, that's the beginning of it. That's the basis of the group, but it forms a group as a result. Heresy always has with it 2 ideas. Skewy thinking, that forms a group. Those go hand in hand. So when you see this word heresy right here, destructive heresies, what they want you to do is join their group. That's what the word heresy means. By using twisted thinking. They want you to join with them. That's what heresy is. If there is no sense of it joining a group, then heresy is the wrong word. There's another word that means that kind of deception. This one means, hey, come with us because this is what's going on. You go, yeah, I'm with you. It's kind of cult-like. Cults want you to believe something that's wrong so that you'll join the cult. Into the faction. So that's the idea when you see heresies. But not only that, it's a destructive heresy, which means that when you join the cult, it will destroy you. So their entire intent through all of this is to lead in alongside what you know to be true, to kind of twist what you know to be true, thinking that you're still on the mark for what's true. And in doing so, they want you to join with them in a cult-like fashion because they've twisted the truth. Peter says that's what's going on. Now, when you read Paul's letters, Paul talks a lot about the problems of the Judaizers, for a better word. And the Judaizers were people who came in after the gospel came in. The gospel would come in, and Paul and Peter and all the guys, they would talk about God's grace and the fact that Jesus died on our behalf and his work is done for us, and it's not about us achieving for God or earning from God anymore. But then the Judaizers would come in and say, hey, wait a second, you guys are way off the mark here. Isn't Christianity a Jewish thing? And back at that time it was. Almost exclusively until you get halfway through Acts. It was a Jewish thing. Okay, if Christianity and following Jesus, the Jewish Messiah, is a Jewish thing, then you can't overlook circumcision. You can't overlook kosher eating. I mean, you can't overlook all that kind of stuff, can you? And so that caused a little war in the first half of Acts and all that kind of stuff. Well, the Judaizers would come in and they would say, we don't disregard Jesus as the Messiah, which is true. But we need to lead in alongside the fact that the Messiah also followed the food rules. Actually, he did, and he didn't. And you'd have to study that to find out what I'm talking about. So anyway, that's destructive heresies. He goes on and talks about these people. What else? Well, they even deny the master who bought them. Of course, that's Jesus. They deny the master who bought them. So in the process of leading in alongside skewy ideas against what's true, in the process, they will push Jesus out of the picture. And in the end, what they'll say is, what I've brought in alongside the truth means that you can actually achieve your own righteousness, and we don't really need Jesus. And yet Jesus bought them. So the whole idea about you becoming righteous is something that Jesus bought for you with his blood. And they'll actually disregard that. This is exactly what Satan wants to do in your life. He'll bring in a skewy thought, and in the end, you'll start thinking that I really don't need Jesus anymore. And when you go fully into that cult of thinking, there's no place for Jesus anymore. There's a lot of Christian sects that have started off leading in slightly skewy ideas, and in the end, Jesus isn't part of the picture at all, except in name, and that's it. I mean, what he has done for them in terms of buying their salvation, the right to that's just gone. And instead, they bring in these skewy ideas like, well, God helps those who help themselves. That's not in the Bible. And especially when it comes to salvation, that's clearly not in the Bible. Okay, you cannot achieve your own salvation. You're wretched and you're sinful. I mean, there's just too much to do on that. You want to say, Erica?
Or I'm also thinking of just partial Jesus.
Partial Jesus, yeah.
A little
Yeah.
bit, and we have to make up the difference.
Yeah. So Jesus does some, we do the rest. Yeah. But if you don't do the rest, you don't get over the bar, and that still relies on you. So yeah. So again, this is the screwiness. Satan knows he can't get away with just saying everything in the Bible is wrong and Jesus doesn't exist and Jesus is a bad guy. He can't get away with doing that, but he can get away with twisting it. So all false religions that look Christian accept the Bible, sort of, accept Jesus, sort of, but the saving grace of what Jesus bought for us, as Peter says it, is gone. It's just gone. It's not part of the picture at all. So when they, I hate this term, but I'll use it anyway. So when they get up to the pearly gates when they die and they're asked, why should you be led into my heaven? You'll say, well, because on large measure I've done more good than bad. And God will say, well, that's not how the system works. The system works on who do you think Jesus is, and have you yielded to his payment on your behalf. So that part of how God's salvation works is completely excluded from these cult-like, slightly twisted, Christian reminiscent religions. And this is what was going on in their time. During their time, it was more about a Jewish kind of influence, Old Covenant to New Covenant. During our time, it's more of a biblical, feel-good something deal. Okay, so anyway, so you have to be careful. They even deny the master. Now, this is a big deal, because remember what Jesus said about denying him? Matthew 10, whoever denies me before men, I'll also deny before my Father who's in heaven. So even those who work to push Jesus out of the salvation picture, they're denying the power of the blood of Jesus in the process. They're saying that doesn't count. That's not a big deal. Oh, we're not against Jesus. We just think we need to still kind of, get on the treadmill and earn our salvation. But we're not against Jesus. Well, that's denying who Jesus is. So at its core. So again, I'll also say this because this comes up a lot here, is the fact that people say, well, all you're telling me that all I have to do is believe in Jesus? Well, I believe he existed. Well, that's not the believing we're talking about. Because a lot of people during the time of Jesus believe he existed historically, and even today. In fact, socioarchaeologically, you can kind of prove the fact that Jesus existed as a historical figure. It's hard to deny that because of what happened in the area. However, that's not the believing we're talking about. It's about putting your faith and your trust in his payment on your behalf, which means that you cannot make that payment yourself. So that's what we're talking about. Not just denying that he existed, but denying what he's done and done for our behalf. And then thirdly, he says about these false teachers, they'll be bringing upon themselves swift destruction. This is a spooky thing. So what he's saying, remember I told you that there was some dissatisfaction growing that had been 3 decades since Jesus, and when is he coming back, and when's he going to bring justice? So this is where Peter starts to get into, well, you don't worry. Their judgment is coming, man. Their justice is coming, and it's coming swiftly. And they would probably counter Peter and say, wait, it's been 3 decades. What do you mean swift? Okay, well, swift is not the swiftest English translation for this word. This swift is this tachynos. In fact, if you own a tachometer to check how fast things go around like your engine, tack, that means fast. A tachometer measures how fast things are rotating. This is the same word in Greek, tach. So tachonos, it actually means something that's impending or without hesitation or without warning. It doesn't necessarily mean a short amount of time. It means it's something that will come when you don't expect it. Like, So whenever you're surprised by something happening and says, oh, that happened fast. Like, I can't believe we're in the middle of May. Whoa, that happened fast. I'm still thinking it's January. So this whole word means something that seems to come almost without warning. It's unexpected. It doesn't have hesitation. It will happen, and it'll happen when you least expect it. It's happening. When justice is swift, we don't normally talk about how fast it comes, but how certain it comes. And that's what this word's talking about. So Peter's reassuring them, okay, I know it's been 30 years since Jesus rose from the dead, and I know Jesus says he's coming back, and I know that he says that when he comes back, he's going to bring justice. But look, they're bringing upon themselves a destruction that's certain. It's swift. They're not going to avoid it. It's happening. Don't think that these people who have been lying in our community are getting away with anything because their destruction is swift. Now, he's also using an interesting kind of linguistic mirror right here. He uses the word destruction here about the destruction of the false teachers, and he also talks about their heresies being destructive. So on the one hand, he's saying, and this is the same word, on the one hand, he's saying what they're trying to get you to believe to enter their belief of cult will bring destruction on you. But guess what? Destruction is coming on them, and it's certain. So they're peddling destruction on you. They're earning destruction for themselves. That's what he's saying right here. And this destruction word, by the way, is it's utter. I mean, it's destruction. Great translation. So why would people follow this? Why would people follow these false teachers' things? I mean, why don't they just stay with who Jesus is and all that kind of stuff? And that's where Peter goes next. Why would people follow this message? Well, because many will follow their sensuality. You mean their false message includes sex? Yes, indeed it does. That's attractive. Now it's much more the case classically in first century Greek influenced culture in the Mediterranean. When you look at false gods and temples to crazy, Aphrodite and all this kind of stuff, you see sex as a component of that. And that's very attractive to people. You remember there were sexual prostitutes that engaged in the worship aspects of those gods, and they involved sex. It was attractive in many ways. Today, a lot of the false teaching we get is more in the ilk of secular ethics, where we say, well, sex to our parents and our grandparents, it always had to be part of marriage per se, but we're more enlightened about that today. It doesn't have to be really in the context of marriage. And so we know better than that today, so we're freed in our understanding. And so, like I remember when I went to college in the early 70s, man, it was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And the message from that generation, my generation, was you need to shake off the mores of that Judeo-Christian ethic. It's oppressive, and you need to kind of experience life for yourself. And that means anything goes. Well, that's attractive. That was very attractive to my generation. That continues to be attractive to every generation, because now my generation is older and ruling parts of the culture and actually, pushing that on their kids. So, I mean, this is what's come. So this is what you see, is that the twist in the truth is always attractive in some kind of way. And for Peter's time especially, and we're not away from this, a lot of the component of the attractiveness is sensuality, is sex. What? Really? Yeah. And because of them, the way of truth will be blasphemed. Because of them, the way of truth will be blasphemed. So as a result, and this is satanic, Satan doesn't engage in this necessarily to give you a new belief. He engages in it to cloak and cover the old belief that's true. So he covers it. Because of this, the way of truth will be blasphemed. And what I just mentioned about, the hippie generation that I was in college and stuff like that, they blaspheme the truth about God's design for marriage, about God's design for sex, about God's design for so many things. And actually blaspheme here, you can simply retranslate as vilify. Just vilify all that stuff and say it's irrelevant. It has no purpose with us. So the actual way of truth is vilified. And that's actually what Satan is in the process of doing, is covering up truth that will actually bring you life with something that he promises will bring you life. But in the end, it doesn't. Sex is a really good example. And I won't talk a lot about sex this morning.
You already have.
I guess I already have, didn't I? But sex is an interesting example because of the attractiveness of that. What's happened now as we get to this part of the 21st century is that sex has been changed, I know at least over my life, into something that was intimate and sort of life-giving, into something that's a little bit more like plumbing and recreation. And there was I see this trend happen, and I know how we got there from here. And my generation is as responsible for this as any generation was. But I mourn for the fact that in the popular secular notion of sex is really more about recreation than it is about intimacy. And when you read some peripheral studies about, I'll get into sex, about satisfaction in sex, is that sex that's disconnected from relationship is not what you would think sex is. It's almost an imposter in many respects. And it's causing a lot of sexual dysfunction in our culture because it's been removed from relationship. So now you can go online and you can hook up with someone for a night with the upfront understanding that there won't be a long-term relationship with this. We just want to do some plumbing recreation. That's all we're going to do. And I mourn for the wonderful intention God made sex for in terms of an intimate connection with another person, shared with only one. I mean, it's really a remarkable thing. It's why when you see some studies about satisfaction of people, there's more satisfaction with sex, there's more satisfaction in married relationships than there is in non-married relationships. And so relationship is a part of that. So anyway, I'll stop talking about sex now. So if you've been putting your fingers in your kids' ears, now you can kind of bring that over. But it's been blasphemy. It's been vilified. So really, what they've said is they brought lies into the equation, lies about the truth. And as a result, it's almost always aimed at bringing license into your behavior. So you lie about the way things are that will actually bring you life. You turn them on their heads, thinking that you're actually bringing liberty when it's licensed to do other stuff, which actually is self-destructive, because that's what Peter said at the start. It's destructive. So that's what they do there. They blaspheme the truth. They vilify it. And then in verse 3 he says, and in their greed they will exploit you with false words. This is a pregnant phrase. I was going to get out of sex. This is a latent phrase right here. They will exploit you. Have you ever been to a store called the Emporium? I don't think there's many Emporiums around here. There was some in California. I think there was some on the East Coast. 60s. Emporium is what this word is. Emporium. It means to buy and sell or to merchandise stuff or to have commercial trade. That's emporium. An emporium is a place where you buy and sell stuff. That's all the word means. It's a totally Greek word. Emporium is where you buy and sell stuff. So if you had a market downtown in Israel, they call them souks. But if you go to one of those places where they have people selling their stuff, their wares and stuff, that would be an emporium. It's where you buy and sell. Well, guess what these people are doing with you? They are turning you into an emporium. It's totally exploitative. And that's why it's a great word. Exploit is a great word. They are engaged with you for their own buying and selling advantage. Now, when you talk about cults, I mean classic cults, where you leave home and you join the cult and all that kind of stuff because of, revealed truth and all that kind of jazz, they really are in it for what you own, because many of the cults actually ask you that when you join the cult, you have all of your assets and you give them to the cult. They emporiumize you, is what they do. One of the largest religions here, when it first founded, did exactly that. They would have people that would be brought in from Europe. They'd proselytize in Europe. And when they would come to Utah, they'd say, now that you're in Utah, you need to give all your goods to the church. And, we have everything common here and we'll take care of you. And then many of them, when they found out that there was actually plural marriage going on here and said, I don't want to be part of this, they didn't have any funds to get back to Europe. You're stuck. So this happens quite commonly in belief systems, is that they emporiumize you. Oh, crap. And then this other word you'll love. False words comes from the Greek word plastos. What does that sound like? It's plastic. That's where you get the word plastic from. Plastos. And plastos in Greek means to form or fashion something. So for instance, when you threw a pot on the clay that's there, or before you placed it on the wheel, you would form it, you'd press it into a shape, and you'd form it into a shape that you can start to work. And in forming that, you're forming that with a goal in mind. So you form it uniquely for a goal in mind. So these people use with you plastic words that are meant to form to your needs, to form to your susceptibilities, to what you want to hear. And in fact, in this particular sense, there is no absolute truth from them. There is a truth that's manipulated and formed for your ears. Boy, this is so true. This is so true. I was reading through some histories about Waco, Texas, and what happened down there in that particular cult. And many of the people who had survived that or had been out of that said, David Koresh, I was going to say Suresh, that'd be bad. David Koresh would basically, as they were bringing people in, he would try and find out what their family situation was, what their stresses were in life, the things they were dealing with, and he would mold his message to appeal to what their needs are. Join us. And it's not like that here. See, this is exactly what's done. Plastic words. I love this. I love this Greek. Plastic words formed for. Now listen, this is a clear and present danger on the internet. And we talked about this back in January, that if you use the internet, some applications on the internet, they track who you are on the internet, right? They track your interests, they track what you boink on, they put together a profile, and at the beginning of these years of them profiling you, it was for the purposes of sending you ads that were better tailored to what you're interested in. And at first, I liked that because I wasn't to be bugged by ads that I don't care about, I don't want to be bugged about gardening equipment because I don't garden. But Dorothy does, so I forwarded them to her. So I don't want to see those things. But when they do bring stuff that I like, I go, hey, I want to read about that. So it was kind of a cool deal. They would take the profiling of who you are, and they would send you ads that have a higher probability of selling to you. That was actually a service to me, believe it or not, and a service to the advertisers. It was a win-win. But now that they've profiled you, they can use that for other things as well. And so they also understand that the time that you spend online, the minutes that tick away as you're online, as you're exposed to side ads that don't have particular profiling parts of them, every minute you spend online, there's a money counter that ticks up every time that ad is in front of your face. And they can actually charge the advertisers based on the face time you have with that. So they understand that they need to increase your face time on their page. So what they will do, and this has been proven, I'm not telling you conspiracy theories, is they will continue to promote things on that page that they know you are sort of interested in because they know your profile, and they know that you want to read about. They'll send you news items that you want to read about. They don't want to send you news items you don't want to read about because that'll chase you away, and they'll lose your face on the time. So slowly, they tend to give you stuff that you want in order to increase your dwell on the page. That is standard internet procedure now. Whether you know it or not, that's how money is made on the internet, that kind of way, for those who can profile you. Well, what they're doing is they're using plastic words. They're using stuff that's formed specifically for you. So this is an excellent application about what's going on, but done in the 21st century kind of style. Once you're aware that they do this, you're pretty much immune, sort of, to the effects of it. You know, it's like you go, oh yeah, I get what they're doing. I saw my news feeds change dramatically in the last year or so when I started showing an interest in renewable energy technology, and I suddenly started getting a whole bunch of new stuff and ads for that. I'm going, well, that's kind of odd. Oh, yeah, that's right. The other day we were having dinner, and I like to put on a little bit of background music, and so we were having Mexican food at home that night. So on my phone, I stuck on, I was Bluetoothing into a speaker. I stuck on, let's listen to mariachi music. So I hit mariachi music, and they're playing. It was really cool. We're eating our burritos. There's mariachi music going, and all of a sudden my ads started coming in Spanish.
It's not funny.
It didn't surprise me. I thought it was interesting. But all I did was choose music. I didn't do anything else. I chose music. By the way, that was on Pandora. So somehow Pandora takes the bits of the profiling information, and suddenly it made its way around to advertisers. And it was within 24 hours, by the way. It was fast. So plastic messages that are uniquely formed to you, or something that haven't been able to do like we can do today in the 21st century. Just beware. This is you. You indeed are actually the product of the internet, not the things that are being sold. You're the product. So they sell you as a product. This is what David Koresh did. This is what the internet advertisers do today. So just beware. Once you know what's happening, it's easier to deal with. So really, the whole idea why people follow these guys, there's a lure of sex, there's a lure of license because of the lies about the past. There's actually a lure of money in a way, because at the same time that they exploit you, they emporiumize you, many times the message is not only, well, I get rich, but I won't tell you about that, but I can now make you rich as well if you follow along. So you just really have to be careful. They're appealing in a very satanic way to your appetites. And so you'll follow into that. And in the process, you will join into the whole idea about vilifying the truth because of what you want. So this is how they do it. This is not new. And by the way, if you're thinking of becoming a false teacher, do not write this down as strategies. Okay, just saying. Well, let me ask this question at this point. How serious are false teachers to God? How serious? So serious that the next thing Peter goes to is the apocalypse. Their condemnation from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. Again, this is back to the 30 years since the resurrection of Jesus. How come justice hasn't come yet? However, in order to emphasize this, like, God has not forgotten what they do. God has not forgotten the destruction that they're bringing within the body of Christ. God hasn't forgotten this. He says, look, their destruction, their condemnation is from long ago, like from the beginning of time, is not idle. It's not sitting idle like your car idles in the parking lot and not going anywhere. This is going someplace. It's been written down. This is happening. These people, condemnation has been written down a long time ago. God has not forgotten. He didn't erase the page he wrote this down on. And on top of that, and this is such a scary phrase, the second half, their destruction is not asleep. Now, there's a bunch of words for asleep, for sleeping in Greek. And this particular one is that thing like, well, what happens to us every night when we're watching TV before we go to bed is we nod off. That action, their destruction is not doing this. Instead, it's like this. It's riveted. So it's a word that's used many times when a predator animal is stalking another animal, and it has to wait maybe a long amount of time for the prey to make a slip up. The predator sits there even through the dark of night and doesn't nod off. It's focused. That's what this word, that's why this is such a scary word. So not only is their condemnation from long ago, but their destruction, that's that same word again, is not asleep. It's actually pursuing them like a tiger pursues a prey, and it's not falling asleep. Now, it may seem like the 30 years since Jesus was resurrected that God's fallen asleep. And Peter's saying, no, it has not fallen asleep. It's as active as ever before. The New English Bible translates this, their destruction waits for them with unsleeping eyes. That's creepy. I mean, that's really creepy. That's why I like, Peter's a fisherman. I don't know where he's coming up with these great words, but this is great stuff. With unsleeping eyes. This is where we get all apocalyptic from talking about false teachers. Look, if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment, this is point number one on his apocalypse parade that's going to happen right now, talking about what's coming to the false teachers. He says, look, God's not going to stop his judgment coming to false teachers because he didn't spare angels, right? And if you know the whole history about angels, there was a portion of them that fell from heaven. They fell. They actually rebelled against God. And angels are, they're way up there, it seems like, in the protocols of important beings in the universe. God didn't withhold judgment from them. And in fact, what he did, he cast them into hell. This hell word is not used very often here. He's actually using a Greek mythology word right here, which is interesting because he's making a point with the Greek mythology word. It's this word Tartaro, which means hellhole, literally. It means a deep hole is what it means. It's a deep hole for hell. So what he's saying is that it's a great picture. So look, if God did not spare angels who, figuratively speaking, are up there in the highly exalted, vaulted parts of heaven, and if he took them and threw them into the hole of hell, see that distance? If that's what God did with them, okay, I get that, and he committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until judgment. So he cast them into this place that they can't get out of, and they're awaiting judgment, which is inevitable, that day of judgment. So if God did that, point two, if he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. So suddenly we go from before time, casting the angels out, if God was that determined for justice, and he actually did this to angels. Now, let's talk about the world at the time of Noah. He killed everybody except 8 people. Wow. That seems like a pretty severe judgment. Yes, it is. That's what I'm saying. He's going all apocalyptic here. So if God did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, and if, this is the apocalypse parade, and if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what's going to happen to the ungodly. If. So now we go from casting out angels to destroying the world at the time of Noah, and now we go to Sodom and Gomorrah. If God did that in order to show the world that he's serious about judgment, he's serious about judgment. Whew. Then, there's another if. And if he rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked. So he's bringing the fact that although there was widespread destruction in Sodom and Gomorrah, then just like Noah was saved, Lot was saved as well. So here's great destruction. In the midst of that, the righteous are being saved. So he wants to make sure you understand that. And then he gives us a little qualifier in case we don't know our Bible history. For as that righteous man, Lot, lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard. We know the story about Lot. Lot's wife turned to a pillar of salt when she looked back, had second thoughts, and the destruction came. This is actually the most generous statement about Lot in the entire Bible. Because when you go back and you read the story about Lot, you think, oh man, Lot, I don't know. But he was, according to Peter and according to the Old Testament, he was saved from that judgment. Because, oh, come on, don't get too harsh on Lot. He was saved from that. But God brought it gets off the topic. God brought widespread destruction. God's serious about judgment. God's serious about justice. He did it to the angels almost as an example to the fact that no one's immune from this kind of justice from God. He did it to the entire world at the time of Noah. He did it to Sodom and Gomorrah, even with the pleading of Abraham on their behalf. God's serious about these problems. That's all Peter's trying to make the point. So if he's done that, then, verse 9, the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials. So these trials are coming, and if you consider yourself on the side of the righteous, will you be able to be saved from that? Well, it worked for Noah and his family. It worked for Lot. So, yes. So don't worry about that. This judgment is indeed coming. It's swift. It cannot be avoided. But for the righteous, they can be saved out of that. So that's point number one. And point number two he makes about these things is that the Lord not only knows how to rescue the godly from trials, but knows how to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment. So, again, that's the idea. If judgment is coming at the end of time, and that justice is coming then, just because there's a delay between the infraction that you might suffer from and the time judgment comes, doesn't mean that God's forgotten. See, that's the point he's trying to make right here. God was very serious about judgment and justice in those previous occasions, and he was unremitting in his justice. But he can also save you out of that. And as well, even if there's a time delay and you figure that God's forgotten, he hasn't forgotten, because the destruction does not nod off. See that? It's there. So these people in the early church in those 30 years that Peter is talking about where they've gotten to, it's been a great irritation not only to Peter but to Paul. You read it through a lot of Acts about these false teachers just causing a lot of problem. And not only that, these are problems that just don't impact day-to-day living. They impact eternal destinies. They're a big, big deal. They're a big, big deal to God, and God's judgment against them is not sleeping, even though it looks like he's waiting too long. The writer of a lot of the Psalms would cry out to God about the injustice, not just David, but others, about the injustice they're suffering. And often, without getting blasted by a thunderbolt from heaven, they'll come right out and say, "Oh God, are you sleeping?" Nope, I just proved it. You're toast. Are you sleeping? So the idea is that in the timeline we live in, it seems wrong that an injustice can happen here, and then the calendar goes by and it goes by, and it just seems to be like there's no justice coming from that. When will justice come? Well, judgment will come at the end of days. And what he's saying right here is, that doesn't mean that justice itself is not going to happen. It's just been delayed. And according to your timeline, you're impatient about it. But here he says, look, God's not unable to do something with these unrighteous. He's got the unrighteous. He holds them under punishment until the day of judgment. So even if they die and don't seem to be under justice or judgment by the time they die, doesn't mean they escaped. At the day of judgment, they'll find justice. So just chill your jets. Don't worry about the fact that injustice happens to you. And it seems like justice doesn't follow because their destruction, their condemnation has been written down from the beginning of time, and their destruction does not nod off. It's coming. It's interesting that his discussion about false teachers would trigger his discussion about apocalyptic justice. Because I think that was just a great struggle in the early church at the time. Will these guys ever meet justice? So there it is. They're held in some kind of holding tank until judgment happens. They have not escaped. Their judgment is coming. God's able to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment, and especially those who indulge in the lust of defiling passion and despising authority, which is another kind of dual phrase to describe what he just talked about in the other verses. Not only are they peddling in defiling and blaspheming the truth, but they do so by indulging in the lust of defiling passion. That's actually the selling point to start the whole thing off. It goes in that. But in the end, what they do is they despise authority. Whose authority? The government? God's authority. They actually despise God's authority by unbelievably marching into the believing community and trying to convince it that what they know about God is false. They absolutely, that's why, if God exists and you believe God exists, this is a really bad tactic if you know that judgment is inevitable. Why would you do this knowing that God's going to find you? Well, no, they despise that authority. They despise it. It doesn't exist. I'm never going to have to pay for this. I'm just going to emporiumize you and get you sucked into my cult, and that'll be it. I'm not going to find justice from God. They despise that kind of divine authority. And that's the only way you can really do that logically, because if you go into it knowing that God exists and what you're doing is you're countering God's plan and his son who revealed who God is, and you're countering all that kind of stuff, why would you do that? You're going to lose in the end. Satan knows this. Satan knows that in the end he's going to lose. In fact, Satan knows that he already has lost. At the cross, he actually has been conquered. So his aspirations for going anywhere is really squashed. He's not going to get very far. He knows he's not going to get very far. But in his hatred for God himself, he wants to drag as many people with him as possible. That's what his tactic is. It's destruction. It's destruction. The good shepherd loves the sheep and cares for the sheep. The bad shepherd comes to steal, kill, and destroy. It's not about bringing life. It's about dragging as many people with him as possible. That's his motivation. So in doing so, what he does is he starts with this appeal of indulging in the lust of defiling passion, and then in the end, you join him in despising godly authority altogether. And then you're lost. Whew. Wow. I think we're done. An up note? How do you deal with false teachers? Well, Paul had this problem when he went on his first, second, and third missionary journeys. Who is this guy who's coming to town? How do we know he's really speaking the truth? So here in Acts 17, these wonderful people, verse 10, the brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea, which is Upper Macedonia, to Berea. And when they arrived, they went into the Jewish synagogue. Verse 11, now these Jews, they were more noble than those in Thessalonica, where they just come from. They received the word with all eagerness. Yay, that makes them noble, right? Well, only partially. What makes them noble is this: examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. So again, I love the pairing of this: eager but test, eager but test. Eager but test. And many times we say, well, if you're skeptical about what's being told to you, you're not eager about it. No, I'm eager about it. I just got to be careful, because I know that the world is full of false teachers whose end is to bring destruction to me by emporiumizing me, by taking advantage of me, by exploiting me. I just got to be careful. So when Paul came into town into Berea, it was a really notable thing. They were eager to hear what Paul had to say. They really wanted to hear, but they said, boy, I really want to make sure this is true, but I'm just going to check up on you. Just going to check up on you. So as a result of that, in the New Testament, the Bereans became somewhat famous because of this, because they were eager to hear about the news about Jesus. But you know what? They had the Old Testament, so they were going to check up on Paul. So they did. And when they did, they said, hey, double thumbs up. This is true. This is true. And I would like to hope and think that when they did their checking up on Paul, Paul would give them some references. He says, hey, look, dude, don't believe me? Here, you can read these scriptures. Let me give you some lists. Go to Isaiah 53, by the way, and see if you see Jesus in that. And by the way, and look at Psalm 2, And I'm sure Paul did these things and said, I want you to check up on me. Let me give you some passages. And that's what we do here too. And by the way, false teachers often will not take that tact with people. They won't say, don't believe me. Let me give you passages and you read it for yourself. They almost never will do that. They'll say, no, trust me. I'm your preferred source for understanding how to interpret the scriptures. And by the way, I'm so good at that, God's given me direct revelation every day as well. So I'm your gateway to God. So you don't check up on me. No fact checking in the Bible. That's not allowed. I'll use the Bible the way I want to use it, and I'll lead it alongside my truth. That's how we're going to do this, because, by the way, you can't do that on your own. You're not studied in those techniques. You just need to listen to me. It's all about me. So many times false teachers are easier to spot because their name is quite prominent in the ministries. Very prominent. The more prominent the name is, doesn't mean they're bad, but a lot of my skepticism hairs go up on the back of my arm. And especially, and this is just my pet peeve, especially when they publish Bibles and put their name on the front of the Bible. Something about that I find a little disconcerting. Now, there's some godly men who do this, but still I'm kind of, this is God's story. This isn't your story. So why is it the Bible? Yeah, I understand how that works because publishers who want to sell Bibles understand they can sell that version of the Bible if they put this person's name on the front because that sells. That's emporiumizing. So you just got to be careful. You just got to watch what's going on. So again, I'll backpedal a little bit. Some very godly men do this. I wish they didn't. But when some people stick their names on the front of the Bible and they are people who lead in alongside truth, you just got to be very careful. All your bells ought to go off when things go off. In fact, Paul himself said, if you've been baptized or if you're in the faith, do you do it claiming Apollos was the guy who did that for you or Paul was the guy who did that? Paul does a really nice argument where he says, I really don't care whose name is in the front of this thing. What I care about is the cross in Christ. I don't care whether you're from Apollos. I don't care if you're from Paul. I don't care if you're from Peter. I don't care who started you in this process. I want Jesus to be glorified and not us. So again, it's a nice feeler that the degree to which ministries promote a man's name prominently, really largely, you got to be skeptical. You got to be careful. So do like what the Bereans do. Be a good Berean. And pick up the word and check against the word, what they say. So that's our nice, our positive send-off. By the way, I think I'm at the end here. Many of them therefore believed. I had to keep this in.
Thank you.
With not a few Greek women of high standing as well as men. Not a few. Yeah, okay. I really like that. We stop at the Berean part and we forget about that. And by the way, this is something very important. If the Bereans were people who were Jews, to start with, Jews who were intelligent enough and literate enough to read the Old Testament and check up on Paul, this implies very strongly that these particular women were also intelligent and also literate. Just saying, there you go. And that, by the way, in the New Testament times was somewhat rare. It was somewhat rare. And these were Greek women of high standing. These were women basically in the elite part of the culture who actually went through the testing process looking at the Old Testament and said, I'm in. They didn't become followers of Jesus because Paul, as a white male, forced them into it, or because their husbands forced them into it. That's exactly what he's saying. It's not any of that influence. It's because they themselves, as high-standing women themselves, checked it out and said, we're in. This is a gigantic vote of confidence for women in the first century. It really is. It's gigantic. It's just gigantic. So there you go. I almost forgot that, didn't I? Yeah, okay. So we're in false teachers. Next week we continue on false teachers. We did the apocalypse parade today about the justice that is coming and is unavoidable by these. Their destruction is swift. It's not nodding off. It's happening. And he's going to finish chapter 2 going even further into it. It's interesting. Out of the 3 chapters of this letter, the entire second chapter is committed to an apocalyptic discussion of what's coming to false teachers. They're getting their due. So as Peter looks forward to a future that may only be about a year away, and later on he'll tell us he kind of senses the fact that his time is coming short, the most important issue on his mind is the influence of false teachers, not the burgeoning destruction and persecution coming out of Nero's Rome. So by the way, I'll put a little PS on that. If indeed what burdened Peter's mind for the future of the body of Christ wasn't the government, but it was false teachers during the time of Nero, then I suggest that we get our priorities straight, that the status of the government is a less problem to us than the influence of false teachers today. Just saying. Okay, let's quit. Are we going to sing a song? Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Father in heaven, we need you so desperately. We are babes in the woods. We're sheep to the slaughter in a sense. There's so many ways in which we can be fooled and deceived, and yet we don't want to be. And through your Spirit and through what you do on our behalf, you give us a clarity of understanding of truth. We just pray that you would continue to protect us from these false teachings that take us down a road of destruction, and that you would preserve for us an understanding of the truth the way it is, because Jesus himself said that once you get the truth, it'll set you free. It'll set you free. And Lord, that's what we want in you. So guard us, protect us from the influences of these false teachers. Lord, we'd be the first to admit the fact that we live in a time and a place where lies and untruth are just rife. And so we don't know how to separate the two often. So we come back to you. We throw ourselves at your feet and say, your Spirit lives in us. Protect us. Give us understanding. Give us wisdom in a place that lacks all of that. So we're yours now, and delighted to be called your children, and delighted about the fact that through your Spirit in us, you preserve us and you protect us just like a good shepherd. So thanks now in Jesus' name. Amen.